Hey, what's up everyone? This is Ryan. So, as it was announced earlier, Spagoots is coming back with a Dungeons & Dragons podcast. And this has me super excited because that means we get to share a big grand old adventure with you guys. The only problem is that upon editing both the preview episode releasing Saturday and our opening episode releasing 2 weeks later, we never really spelt out the rules of Dungeons & Dragons, and unless you've played it before, or unless you've listened to Critical Role or The Adventure Zone, you probably don't know much about Dungeons & Dragons outside of the fact that it's a nerdy game for nerds. Of course, you'd be absolutely correct, but that's beside the point. So I figured I'd make this short video telling you newcomers the very basic gist of how Dungeons & Dragons works. That way, when you're listening to the episodes, you're not completely alienated. Now, before we start, just a quick note. When I say very basic gist, I mean very basic gist. Only because this video is literally being made in a couple days' time during a relatively stressful school time. It'll go over everything you essentially need to know in order to enjoy and not be confused by the teaser episode dropping Saturday. If you want to pursue learning how to play D&D, then I've linked some super helpful videos in the description that will do a far better job of teaching you than this video. So first things first, when playing Dungeons & Dragons, there's two types of people. There are the players who control their own characters, and then there's the DM, or Dungeon Master, who controls literally everything else, like the rules and NPCs. So using realms as an example, which I will be doing quite a bit in this video, Kay, Judy, Ava, and Ava's boyfriend Vin are all players, and they all have their own characters. Meanwhile, I am the DM, and I am in charge of shaping the world around them and planning the events that will unfold around our four heroes. A good comparison I've heard is imagine an author is writing a book, only some of the characters are alive and acting on their own free will. The author is the DM, and the characters are the players. So let's start with the characters. Like I mentioned, each player creates their own character, and the creation of a character is pretty much the equivalent of a character creation screen. When creating a character, the first thing you need is a race and a class. The races include your standard fantasy bunch, human, elf, dwarf, halfling, dragonborn, gnome, and others. Each one has their own perks as one would expect. Then there's your class, which determines how your character fights, where you have fighters, the classic sword and melee weapon users, rangers, a user predominantly bows and arrows, wizards, your classic spellcasters, rogues, the sneaky fellas, clerics, a class that uses divine magic to heal and deal damage, and others. These can be mixed and matched to create a slew of interesting characters. And the players may also create backstories, personality traits, and pretty much anything and everything that makes a character a well-rounded character. So as an example, we're going to look at Kay's character, Thornelenorwyn, but we just prefer to call him Thorny. Thorny is a high elf fighter who wasn't very book-smart, so he didn't really have a place in his city full of really book-smart high elves. He eventually found his place on the Volunteer Crime Watch Task Force, which he excelled at. When his pride got to his head and he started to use a bit shadier methods to stop crime, the council asked him to step down. However, because of the aforementioned pride, he chose to leave the city and become a traveling bounty hunter for hire. He made a name for himself and always followed his one rule of do not kill. He's a whopping 6'10", always carries around his pike that he names Zeno, and he's always ready to have some justice happen. Yeah. Now that whole aside was just pretty much my way of saying that your backstory can be whatever you want it to be so long as the DM allows it. But there's a lot more to a character than just backstory and personality traits. We need to focus on stats. Now, I won't go too deep into the nuance of character creation, but after a lot of dice rolling, you come up with 6 numbers that can be put into 6 stats. Strength, which marks physical strength, dexterity, which marks how nimble you are, constitution, which marks how sturdy you are, intelligence, which marks how book-smart you are, wisdom, which marks more of how sage and insightful you are, that type of smart, and charisma, which marks how likable you are and how convincing you can be. Now, these are the numbers that Kay ended up getting and going with when rolling for Thorny's character, and when put into Thorny's character sheet, you get this. Now, while the number of the stat is a good measure, the most important numbers are the pluses and minuses you see here. They're known as modifiers. See, in Dungeons & Dragons, most conflicts are resolved using the 20-sided die, or the D20. These are done using checks, and if the player rolls high enough, then they succeed. If not, then they fail. The modifiers are there to change the value of the D20 roll. So, for example, let's say that Thorny is trying to rip a fantasy-style cash register off of its foundation. This is an actual thing that happened, and I refuse to give context. In order to do that, Kay would have to make a strength check. Kay rolls the D20 and gets a 14. However, Thorny has a strength modifier of +2, so the result is actually 16. Then it's up to the DM to decide if that number roll is high enough to pass the check. Furthermore, you have skills and saving throws. Skills are just checks only for more specific situations, like if you need to tame a horse, then you'd probably do an animal handling check. Or if you're sneaking past someone, you'd probably do a stealth check. Or if you're disguised as someone else and you're trying to act like them, you'd roll a performance check, and so on. Saving throws are more so for if you ever need to act on reflexes, so if you're about to get blindsided by an arrow, the DM will tell you to roll a dexterity saving throw and try to dodge it. Also, in any check, you can have either advantage or disadvantage depending on how you handle the situation. In advantage, you roll 2 die, and you pick the highest roll, and in disadvantage, you pick the lowest roll out of the 2 die. So let's say, as an example, Thorny's trying to persuade someone using a persuasion check. If he just gave that person a bag of money, it might have advantage. But if he just punched that person in the face, it might have disadvantage. Final note, but an important one, if you roll the d20 and it lands on a 20, it is known as a natural 20 and you succeed in your check no matter what your modifier is. And on the flip side, if you roll the d20 and it lands on a 1, then that is a critical fail, and you get embarrassed and fail no matter what. And that's the gist of basic gameplay and character creation. A lot of dice rolling happens. Next, we'll talk about the nitty-gritty, the combat. So when a battle begins, the first thing that needs to be determined is battle order. After all, this is a turn-based game, so you need to make sure you know who goes first. This is done by everyone rolling for initiative. They roll a d20, surprise, surprise, add their initiative modifier, and then they take turns in order from who rolled the highest to who rolled the lowest. In one turn, you mostly only have the option to move the distance marked by your speed, which varies depending on race, and perform an action. An action can be attacking, casting a spell to attack, and any other action depending on the DM. When you attack someone, you roll a d20, add a modifier attributed to the weapon you're using, and if that number is higher than your enemy's armor class, then it's a hit. Likewise, if your character is attacked, if the attacker rolls lower than your character's armor class, or AC for short, then the attack fails and does no damage. Spells are kind of their own beast, seeing how each one comes with its own description and rules, so we won't talk about those in this video. Finally, if a player character is brought down to 0 hit points, they are only unconscious, not dead. The only way a character can be killed off forever is if A, the player's health is brought down below negative half of their total HP. For instance, if a character has 20 total hit points and then takes a hit so hard that its new HP is negative 10, that character dies immediately and is dead forever, unless story shenanigans happen. Or B, if they fail 3 death saves, which in Realms we'll explain if we come across it. And yeah, that's combat in a nutshell, a lot quicker. So we've talked about character creation, the mechanics of the game, so the next most potent question is, what do you do in Dungeons & Dragons? The basic answer is whatever you want, and the more complex answer goes as follows. The DM has a campaign ready for you, whether it's an official campaign fixed up by the creators of D&D or a homebrew campaign written up all by themselves. This campaign promises a grand adventure, hopefully filled with perilous situations, friendly NPCs, tough enemies, and a grand old time to be had. And how you approach the adventure is up to you as a player. If you see a locked door, you can try to find the key, try to pick the lock, try to punch the door open, or try to even sweet-talk someone to unlock the door for you. The possibilities are mostly endless, and you can approach the situation in your way from a staggering variety of options, with your success or failure determined by the roll of the d20. Then it's the DM's job to improvise and completely change up their story depending on whatever stupid stunt your character decides to pull off. But honestly, that's what makes Dungeons & Dragons so appealing to me. It's so incredibly open-ended, and you can try almost anything, any creative idea, any creative approach. Heck, some of the best moments come from when someone tried to do something completely unexpected. Like for instance, once when Judy wasn't here, I decided to do a little one-off campaign with Ava's character Altivo, Kay's character Thorny, and Vin's character Vinka. The story I had planned was the 3 get hired by Fantasy McDonald's to pay some bills, and while it happens, it gets robbed and they have to fight off the people who are trying to mug them. Thought there might be some comedy about how stupid the customers might be. I'd be able to get a good action scene in with a big 3v4 fight. What ended up happening is that the second they got keys to the place, they immediately robbed it for everything it had, including all of its nuggets. When the robbers came in, they said that they were already robbed and said, hey, if it makes you feel any better, we hate our job enough, you can just ransack the place. And they ransacked it together. All the while, Vinka gave them a cursed videotape, which he believed to be cursed only because he kept on failing the checks to try to break it. and Thorny tried to sneak out an entire cash register that he ripped out of the counter as a trophy, which worked to varying degrees of success, but still. It made for a way more interesting story than I had planned. So, yeah, that's D&D. Hope this video helped you all out, and we look forward to sharing Spagoots Realms.